One immediate fallout of the recent change in US policy and law relates to the US withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran. The fallout in the EU has been the so-called blocking legislation, which was already in force, but related principally to ancient legislation. In response to the US withdrawal, the EU extended the legislation that the bloc applies to include the resurrected US sanctions against Iran. The bloc means that EU operators and anyone else falling within the scope of application of the bloc is prohibited from complying with the listed measures. And many businesses in the EU will find themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place. Effectively, they have to choose whether to comply with US secondary sanctions and thereby breach the EU blocking legislation, or conversely, comply with the EU blocking legislation and expose themselves to US secondary sanctions. There's an awful lot of misunderstanding around what US secondary sanctions are, not least in the blocking legislation itself, which refers to required compliance. US secondary sanctions are directed at non-US persons behaving entirely lawfully under applicable law outside of the US, but nevertheless acting contrary to what the US sanctions position is. In those circumstances, the US wouldn't have any jurisdiction to impose civil or criminal penalties, but instead they can adopt secondary sanctions. And the worst type of these secondary sanctions would be a listing. So as a result of acting perfectly lawfully in the EU, you could find yourself designated on a list in the US, which effectively makes you the subject of what the US terms a block, in the sense that all your assets in the US are blocked and any US person is prohibited from dealing with you. So it's quite a harsh penalty, and the choice then becomes all the more difficult as a result. Do you want what many refer to as financial death, or do you want a criminal or a civil or an administrative penalty imposed on you depending on where you are in the EU, because each member state enforces the blocking legislation in their own particular way. That's a problem. A second problem is a compliance problem. It remains to be seen what exactly compliance prohibited compliance will be deemed to be, if it will include representations and warranties and contracts, etc. You also have obligations to report when your financial or economic interests are affected by the blocked US legislation. And in the UK, the way that the EU blocking legislation is implemented, if you get that reporting obligation wrong, you're committing a criminal offence. So the stakes are high, and it remains to be seen exactly how EU businesses are going to cope with the additional pressure on them from a sanctions perspective.